The languid rhythm of life in Sacramento's suburbs, a place where privacy was prized and predictability cherished, was shattered by a chilling discovery. One house, the Miller residence, always stood out, a picture of domestic tranquility, meticulously maintained, radiating an aura of family. It was home to David Miller, a successful engineer, his 18-year-old son, Brandon, a boy wrestling with the ghosts of his past, and Sarah, David's second wife, a woman striving to bridge the chasm of a fractured family. Behind the manicured lawn and the freshly painted facade, however, a simmering discontent festered, a corrosive undercurrent threatening to unravel the carefully constructed image of normalcy. Brandon, haunted by the early loss of his mother, carried a weight of grief that no amount of time seemed to alleviate. He saw Sarah not as a nurturing presence, but as an intruder, a usurper attempting to fill a void that could never be filled. His resentment grew, a malignant vine twisting around his heart, choking out any possibility of acceptance. He couldn't comprehend his father's affection for this new woman, viewing it as a betrayal of his mother's memory and a threat to his own position within the family. David, caught in the crossfire of his son's animosity and his burgeoning love for Sarah, desperately tried to maintain a semblance of peace. He clung to the hope that time, the great healer, would eventually mend the rift that had opened within his family. He yearned for a unified, loving home, but his efforts were continually thwarted by Brandon's escalating hostility. Like a gardener attempting to cultivate a barren landscape, David poured his energy into a seemingly futile endeavor. Brandon retreated further into himself, his jealousy morphing into open defiance, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Sarah, acutely aware that she could never replace Brandon's mother, walked a tightrope of patience and understanding. She extended olive branches of kindness and acceptance, but each gesture was met with icy rejection, leaving her feeling isolated and unwelcome in her own home. The house, once a symbol of family unity, became a battleground for unspoken resentments and simmering rage. The conflict, a relentless undertow, dragged the family deeper into a vortex of despair, culminating in a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The tranquility of that seemingly ordinary Sacramento morning was shattered by a horrific discovery. Nancy Olson, the Millers' next-door neighbor, stepped onto her porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands, completely unaware that she was about to witness a scene that would forever be etched into her memory. She often saw Brandon leaving for his morning run, a familiar sight in the quiet neighborhood. This morning, however, something felt different, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that pricked at her intuition. A flicker of movement caught her eye, drawing her attention to the Millers' backyard. At first, she dismissed it as a discarded garden tool or a fallen branch, but as she peered closer, a chilling realization washed over her. It was a body, lying still and unnatural amidst the carefully tended flower beds. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach as she recognized Sarah Miller, her body contorted at an unsettling angle. The idyllic facade of the Miller family, the carefully cultivated image of prosperity and happiness, crumbled before Nancy's eyes, revealing the dark secrets hidden beneath the surface. The quiet street, usually a haven of tranquility, was now the scene of a devastating tragedy, a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary of settings, darkness can lurk. Nancy, her hand trembling, reached for the phone, her voice a shaky whisper as she reported the grim discovery to the emergency dispatcher. The wheels of justice were set in motion, and the peaceful suburban street was transformed into a crime scene, buzzing with the activity of investigators and curious onlookers. The arrival of the police transformed the quiet street into a scene of controlled chaos. Neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights and the murmur of hushed voices, gathered on their porches, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. A yellow tape cordoned off the Miller property, creating a stark barrier between the mundane and the macabre. The ambulance arrived, its flashing lights adding to the surreal atmosphere, but the paramedics could only confirm what Nancy had already suspected: Sarah Miller was dead. The air thickened with a palpable sense of unease, the quiet morning shattered by the realization that something truly terrible had happened. Detective Linda Hart arrived, her sharp eyes scanning the scene, absorbing every detail. She noted the position of the body, the unnatural angle of the limbs, the subtle clues that hinted at a violent end. Her gaze shifted to the house, a picture of suburban normalcy now tainted by the shadow of death. Inside, she found David Miller, a man shattered by grief, his face pale, his eyes haunted by the horror of what he had discovered. Brandon, in stark contrast, maintained an unnerving composure, his gaze distant and unfocused. Linda registered this discrepancy, a subtle dissonance that added another layer to the already complex puzzle. She knew that beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary family, dark currents flowed, currents that had ultimately led to this tragic outcome. Her investigation began, a meticulous search for the truth hidden within the shattered remnants of a family. The investigation into Sarah Miller's death became a painstaking process of unraveling the tangled threads of family secrets and hidden resentments. Detective Hart, a seasoned investigator with an uncanny ability to discern truth from deception, began her methodical examination of the evidence. The Miller house, once a sanctuary of domesticity, became a crime scene, its every corner scrutinized for clues. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting that the perpetrator was someone familiar with the family, someone who had access to the house and knew its routines. The focus shifted to the family itself, the intricate web of relationships that held the key to unlocking the mystery. David Miller, still reeling from the shock of his wife's death, provided a fragmented account of their family life, painting a picture of a happy marriage marred only by Brandon's difficulty in accepting Sarah. He spoke of Brandon's withdrawal after his mother's death, his struggle to cope with the loss, but avoided any mention of overt conflict. Linda, however, sensed a carefully constructed narrative, a veil drawn over deeper, more turbulent emotions. She noted the tremor in David's voice, the subtle avoidance of certain topics, the unspoken anxieties that lingered beneath the surface of his words. The interview with Brandon presented a different challenge. The young man, outwardly calm, maintained an unsettling detachment, his answers brief and evasive. He confirmed his strained relationship with Sarah, admitting his dislike for her, but denied any involvement in her death. His composure, however, seemed unnatural, a mask concealing a deeper turmoil. Linda, a keen observer of human behavior, recognized the subtle signs of suppressed emotion, the tightly clenched hands, the averted gaze, the carefully measured responses. She knew that beneath the surface of this seemingly placid exterior, a storm raged. The investigation expanded beyond the confines of the Miller house, reaching into the quiet suburban streets, seeking further insights into the family dynamic. Nancy Olson's account of Brandon's unusual behavior on the morning of the murder added another piece to the puzzle. His early return from his run, his cold demeanor, the subtle shift in his routine, all hinted at a hidden agenda. Other neighbors corroborated Nancy's observations, painting a picture of a young man increasingly isolated and withdrawn, his behavior marked by erratic mood swings and suppressed anger. The pieces began to fall into place, revealing a pattern of escalating tension, a simmering resentment that had finally boiled over with tragic consequences. The idyllic facade of the Miller family crumbled further, revealing the dark undercurrents that had ultimately led to Sarah's death. The investigation continued, each new piece of evidence adding another layer to the complex tapestry of the Miller family tragedy. Linda Hart, relentless in her pursuit of the truth, delved deeper into Brandon's life, seeking to understand the psychological landscape that had led to such a devastating act. She recognized that Brandon's grief over his mother's death was a profound wound, a festering sore that had never truly healed. This unresolved trauma, coupled with the arrival of Sarah, whom he perceived as a replacement rather than a new family member, created a volatile cocktail of resentment and anger. Linda sought the expertise of a child psychologist, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of Brandon's emotional state. Together, they pieced together a psychological profile, revealing a young man struggling with a deep sense of loss and abandonment. Brandon's childhood, once filled with the warmth of a mother's love, had been abruptly shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief. He had retreated into himself, building walls of silence and isolation, unable to process the overwhelming emotions that consumed him. The psychologist pointed out that Brandon's perception of Sarah was distorted by his unresolved grief. He saw her not as an individual but as a symbol of his mother's absence, a constant reminder of what he had lost. This distorted perception fueled his resentment, transforming it into a consuming obsession. The psychologist suggested that Brandon's outward calmness was a facade, a fragile mask concealing a deep well of anger and despair. This suppressed rage, simmering beneath the surface, had likely erupted in a moment of uncontrolled fury, leading to the tragic consequences. Linda's investigation also uncovered a pattern of escalating conflict between Brandon and Sarah. Neighbors reported frequent arguments, heated exchanges that shattered the illusion of domestic tranquility. One neighbor recalled hearing muffled screams coming from the Miller house on the morning of Sarah's death, a chilling detail that added weight to the growing suspicion that the murder was the culmination of a long-simmering feud. The forensic evidence, while circumstantial, further solidified Linda's suspicions. Microscopic traces of Sarah's blood were found on Brandon's clothing, a chilling link to the crime scene. While the amount of blood was too small to definitively prove his direct involvement, it suggested a close proximity to the violence. Furthermore, footprints found near Sarah's body matched Brandon's shoes, placing him at the scene of the crime around the time of the murder. Linda knew that these pieces of evidence, while not conclusive on their own, added to the mounting case against Brandon. She also discovered that Brandon had been researching topics related to violence and self-defense online in the days leading up to the murder, a disturbing revelation that hinted at a premeditated act. These searches, coupled with his increasingly erratic behavior and his expressed animosity towards Sarah, painted a grim picture of a young man spiraling towards a violent act. As the investigation progressed, Linda uncovered Sarah's diary, a poignant chronicle of her struggles to connect with Brandon and her growing fear of his unpredictable behavior. The diary entries revealed a woman desperately trying to bridge the gap between herself and her stepson, only to be met with consistent rejection and hostility. Sarah's words, written in the privacy of her own thoughts, provided a chilling glimpse into the escalating tension within the Miller household. She expressed her concern for her safety, her fear that Brandon's anger might one day erupt into violence. These entries, a tragic foreshadowing of her fate, added a deeply personal dimension to the investigation, solidifying Linda's determination to bring Sarah's killer to justice. The weight of the evidence, both physical and psychological, began to mount against Brandon. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, revealing a disturbing picture of a young man consumed by grief, resentment, and ultimately, murderous rage. Linda knew that the final piece of the puzzle lay in securing a confession from Brandon, a confession that would bring closure to the case and finally reveal the full truth behind the tragedy that had shattered the quiet suburban street. The net tightened around Brandon. Detective Hart, armed with a growing body of evidence, knew that a confession was the key to closing the case. She understood that Brandon's outward stoicism was a fragile defense, a desperate attempt to shield himself from the crushing weight of his actions. The challenge was to break through that barrier, to penetrate the wall of silence he had erected around himself. Linda revisited Brandon's digital footprint, meticulously analyzing his phone records and online activity. Deleted messages, painstakingly recovered by forensic experts, revealed a disturbing pattern of communication with an unknown individual on social media. In these messages, Brandon expressed his intense hatred for Sarah, seeking validation for his dark thoughts and even soliciting advice on how to deal with her. These cryptic exchanges, unearthed from the digital graveyard, provided a chilling glimpse into Brandon's premeditation, suggesting that the murder was not a spontaneous act of rage but a carefully considered plan. Further analysis of Brandon's phone revealed unsent drafts of messages, filled with venomous pronouncements and veiled threats directed at Sarah. These digital ghosts, never intended for the recipient's eyes, offered a stark window into the turmoil raging within Brandon's mind. They painted a picture of a young man consumed by dark fantasies, his thoughts spiraling towards a violent resolution. A crucial breakthrough came in the form of a grainy surveillance video recovered from a camera located several blocks from the Miller residence. The video, time-stamped near the estimated time of Sarah's death, captured a figure resembling Brandon walking towards the house, carrying a bag that investigators believed contained the murder weapon. This visual confirmation of Brandon's presence at the scene during the critical timeframe placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the investigation. The forensic team also revisited the crime scene, their meticulous examination yielding another vital clue. Brandon's fingerprints were discovered on a set of knives in Sarah's kitchen. While the murder weapon itself had been cleaned, the presence of his prints on other knives in the set suggested that he had handled them, potentially selecting the weapon used in the attack. This discovery, combined with the mounting digital evidence and the surveillance footage, created a compelling case against Brandon. Linda, armed with this new evidence, decided to confront Brandon once more. This time, the interrogation took a different tack. Instead of direct accusations, Linda employed a strategy of empathy and understanding, hoping to chip away at Brandon's carefully constructed facade. She spoke of the pain of losing his mother, the difficulty of adjusting to a new family dynamic, the overwhelming pressure he must have felt. A psychologist was present during the interrogation, offering support and further reinforcing the message that Brandon was not alone in his struggles. This approach, a delicate balance of compassion and firmness, gradually eroded Brandon's defenses. He began to speak, haltingly at first, about the darkness that had consumed him, the overwhelming sense of isolation and despair. He described the escalating arguments with Sarah, the simmering resentment that had poisoned their relationship. He spoke of the day of the murder, the final confrontation that had pushed him over the edge. As Brandon recounted the events leading up to Sarah's death, his voice trembled with a mixture of anger and remorse. He admitted to losing control, to grabbing a knife in a fit of rage, to inflicting the fatal blows. The confession, though shrouded in emotional turmoil, was clear and undeniable. The carefully constructed wall of silence finally crumbled, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface. With Brandon's confession secured, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The investigation that had gripped the quiet suburban community was finally over. Justice, though bittersweet, would be served. The tragedy of the Miller family served as a stark reminder of the destructive power of unresolved grief and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. It was a lesson that Linda Hart would carry with her, a testament to the importance of understanding the complexities of human emotion and the fragility of the human psyche. The wheels of justice turned, albeit slowly, grinding towards the inevitable conclusion of the Miller case. With Brandon's confession secured, the focus shifted from investigation to prosecution. The district attorney, armed with a compelling narrative of jealousy, rage, and premeditation, prepared for trial, confident in a guilty verdict. The case, however, was far from straightforward. Brandon's defense team, while acknowledging the horrific nature of the crime, sought to mitigate his culpability by portraying him as a victim of circumstance, a young man driven to desperation by the unresolved trauma of his mother's death and the perceived intrusion of his stepmother into his life. They argued that Brandon's actions were not the result of cold-blooded malice, but rather a tragic consequence of his fragile emotional state, a desperate act born of pain and confusion. The trial became a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the nation. The story of a seemingly ordinary suburban family torn apart by tragedy resonated with a morbid fascination, fueling public debate about the complexities of family dynamics, the devastating impact of grief, and the often blurred lines between victim and perpetrator. The courtroom became a stage for a dramatic unfolding of the Miller family's darkest secrets. David Miller, a broken man consumed by grief and guilt, testified about his failed attempts to connect with his son, his desperate hope that time would heal the wounds of the past. He spoke of his love for Sarah, his devastation at her loss, and the agonizing realization that his own son was responsible for her death. His testimony, raw and emotionally charged, painted a heartbreaking picture of a family fractured beyond repair. Friends and neighbors took the stand, their recollections adding further layers to the portrait of Brandon as a troubled young man, isolated and consumed by his inner demons. They spoke of his withdrawn nature, his erratic behavior, his veiled threats against Sarah. Their testimonies, while not directly implicating him in the murder, corroborated the prosecution's narrative of a young man spiraling towards violence. The defense, in their attempt to mitigate Brandon's culpability, presented expert testimony from psychologists who diagnosed him with chronic depression and post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from his mother's death. They argued that Brandon's mental state, exacerbated by the perceived threat posed by Sarah, had impaired his judgment, leading him to act in a manner inconsistent with his true character. The prosecution countered with the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, highlighting the chilling digital exchanges, the unsent messages, and the internet searches related to violence and evading responsibility. They argued that Brandon's actions, while undoubtedly influenced by his emotional turmoil, were ultimately a conscious choice, a deliberate act of violence driven by jealousy and rage. The jury, faced with the daunting task of weighing the evidence and determining Brandon's fate, deliberated for days. The case, a complex tapestry of psychological trauma, family dysfunction, and undeniable violence, presented a moral and legal quagmire. The verdict, when it finally came, was a somber pronouncement of guilt. Brandon Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder, a verdict that acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of his mental state while still holding him accountable for his actions. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair, the courtroom heavy with the weight of the tragedy. The judge, acknowledging the complexities of the case, handed down a lengthy prison sentence, a punishment that reflected the severity of the crime while also allowing for the possibility of rehabilitation and eventual reintegration into society. Brandon, his face impassive, received the sentence with a quiet resignation, his fate now sealed. David Miller, his shoulders slumped with grief and exhaustion, left the courtroom a broken man. His family shattered, his life irrevocably altered. For Linda Hart, the case represented a profound and unsettling journey into the dark recesses of the human psyche. It was a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unresolved trauma, the fragility of family bonds, and the importance of seeking help before the whispers of despair escalate into a roar of violence. The Miller case, though closed, would continue to haunt her, a chilling testament to the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary lives. The aftermath of the Miller trial rippled through the quiet Sacramento suburb, leaving a residue of unease and unanswered questions. The story, a tragic tapestry woven with threads of grief, resentment, and violence, became a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors, a stark reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, darkness can fester unseen. The media circus that had surrounded the trial eventually moved on, seeking new stories of heartbreak and scandal. But for those intimately involved, the wounds remained fresh, the scars a permanent reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. Brandon Miller, now a convicted murderer, began his life within the confines of prison walls, his future a bleak and uncertain landscape. The young man who had once been a promising student, a beloved son, was now reduced to a number, his identity forever intertwined with the horrific act he had committed. He would spend years, perhaps decades, grappling with the weight of his actions, navigating the complexities of remorse, regret, and the daunting prospect of rebuilding a life shattered by violence. David Miller, burdened by the dual loss of his wife and son, retreated into a shell of grief and solitude. The once vibrant engineer, the devoted husband and father, became a ghost of his former self, haunted by the memories of a life that had crumbled before his eyes. He struggled to reconcile his love for Brandon with the horrific act he had committed, a torturous dichotomy that consumed his thoughts and fueled his despair. The house that had once been a symbol of family unity, a testament to his dreams of a happy future, now stood empty, a silent monument to a shattered life. He could no longer bear to live within its walls, surrounded by the ghosts of what he had lost. He sold the house, severing the last tangible connection to his former life, and disappeared from the quiet suburban street, seeking solace in anonymity, hoping to find a way to rebuild a life stripped bare by tragedy. For Linda Hart, the case represented a turning point in her career. The emotional toll of the investigation, the intimate glimpse into the darkest corners of the human heart, left her with a profound sense of weariness and a renewed determination to understand the root causes of violence. She became an advocate for mental health awareness, recognizing the crucial role that unresolved trauma and untreated mental illness can play in tragic outcomes. She dedicated herself to not only solving crimes but also to preventing them, working with community organizations to provide support and resources to families struggling with similar challenges. The Miller case, though a painful chapter in her life, became a catalyst for positive change, a driving force behind her unwavering commitment to seeking justice and promoting healing. The quiet suburban street, once the scene of unimaginable horror, gradually returned to its former tranquility. Life moved on, but the memory of the tragedy lingered, a subtle undercurrent beneath the surface of everyday life. The Miller case served as a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary of settings, darkness can lurk, and that the seeds of destruction can be sown in the fertile ground of unresolved pain and unspoken rage. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of tragedy, a lesson that would resonate for years to come. Years passed, seasons changed, and the quiet suburban street where the Miller tragedy unfolded slowly began to heal. The memory of Sarah's death, once a raw and open wound, gradually faded into a scar, a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. New families moved into the neighborhood, children played on the sidewalks, and the rhythm of everyday life resumed its steady beat. The Miller house, once a symbol of shattered dreams, was renovated, repainted, and filled with the laughter of a new family, oblivious to the darkness that had once resided within its walls. The past, though never truly forgotten, began to recede into the background, replaced by the vibrant tapestry of the present. Brandon Miller, lost within the labyrinthine corridors of the prison system, embarked on a long and arduous journey of self-reckoning. The anger and resentment that had once consumed him slowly gave way to a profound sense of remorse and regret. He began to confront the demons that had driven him to commit such a horrific act, seeking solace in therapy and spiritual guidance. He enrolled in educational programs, immersing himself in books and learning, hoping to find a path towards redemption and a way to make amends for the pain he had caused. He corresponded with his father, David, their letters filled with a mixture of sorrow, forgiveness, and a shared yearning for healing. The relationship, once fractured beyond repair, began to mend, albeit slowly and tentatively, across the chasm of incarceration and grief. David Miller, after years of wandering in the wilderness of his grief, found a measure of peace. He established a foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to supporting families affected by domestic violence and promoting mental health awareness. He channeled his pain into a positive force, hoping to prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation that had shattered his own life. He never forgot Sarah, her memory a constant source of inspiration and a reminder of the love that had been tragically cut short. He also maintained contact with Brandon, offering him unwavering support and encouragement, believing that even in the darkest of circumstances, redemption was possible. He learned to forgive, not only Brandon but also himself, recognizing that the tragedy was a culmination of complex factors, a confluence of unresolved grief, miscommunication, and a desperate cry for help that had gone unanswered. Detective Linda Hart, forever marked by the Miller case, continued her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She became a tireless advocate for victims' rights, working to ensure that their voices were heard and their stories acknowledged. She also championed initiatives aimed at early intervention and prevention, recognizing the crucial importance of addressing the root causes of violence before they escalate into tragedy. The Miller case, though a painful reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human heart, also served as a powerful motivator, fueling her unwavering commitment to seeking justice and promoting healing. The quiet suburban street, once the scene of unspeakable horror, became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the enduring power of community and the human capacity for healing and renewal. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of a tragedy that had transformed lives, a tragedy that had ultimately led to a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of hope and forgiveness.